Welcome back. With this lecture, we begin the Reformation properly. We begin with the most important figure of the Reformation, Martin Luther. Now, this lecture is going to be divided into two parts as far as the videos, although I'll have one set of PowerPoint notes for you on Moodle. And that will be the same for the next several lectures. There will be one set of PowerPoints, and that will be broken up into a couple of videos for each one of them. So pay close attention to the numbering and enjoy as we begin our study of the Reformation proper. And we begin with, as I say, the most important individual of the Reformation, Martin Luther. The Protestant Reformation was the 16th century religious, political, intellectual, and cultural upheaval that splintered Catholic Europe. And Catholic Europe was more than just the church. We're talking about virtually a whole society, a political arrangement, an intellectual arrangement with the universities and schools, as well as a cultural arrangement that pretty much centered all of life around the church. The year was divided by the church calendar. Even daily life was guided by the rites and rituals of the Catholic Church. All of that gets upset by the Reformation, and in part by the Renaissance, which we dealt with in the last lecture, setting in place the structures and beliefs that would define the continent in the modern era. So this is a major transition. In the Northern and Central Europe, reformers like Martin Luther, John Calvin, and this author has Henry VIII, as we'll see in a later lecture. Whether he was a reformer or not is to be determined. I guess that's a matter of definition. But in any case, these reformers challenged papal authority, questioned the Catholic Church's ability to define Christian practice, and they argued for a religious and political redistribution of power into the hands of Protestant pastors and princes. What that means is, again, the Catholic Church was so integrally involved and intertwined with the political structures that when the church was challenged, the political powers that be were challenged, and there were some significant changes that began because of the Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was a widespread theological revolt in Europe against the abuses and totalitarian control of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, as the little note on the side says, this was written by a secular historian, and this is a thoroughly Protestant description. So I just added a little note there that description of abuses and totalitarian control might be a little harsh. Perhaps by our modern standards it was. Reformers such as Martin Luther in Germany, Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland, and John Calvin in France, actually John Calvin was in Switzerland himself as well, protested the various unbiblical practices of the Catholic Church and promoted a return to sound biblical doctrine. The precipitating event in the Protestant Reformation is generally considered to be Luther's posting of his 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Church on October the 31st, 1517. And that certainly is the case, but I don't think we can cite the beginning of the Reformation with quite such precision. It was actually a gradual process, although there were a number of landmark events, single events, that we could point to, and I guess it's absolutely correct to cite the first of those landmark events as Luther's posting of the 95 Theses. Luther was born, let's turn to Luther himself. Luther was born on November the 10th, 1483, and historian Carl Trueman likes to remind us that Luther was a thoroughly medieval man, even though he began some very unmedieval sort of changes for the Catholic Church. And he was born in Eisleben, Saxony, located in modern-day Germany. His parents, Hans and Marguerite, her maiden name was Lindemann, Luther, or Luder, as the family name is sometimes understood, were of peasant lineage, but they themselves weren't peasants. His parents weren't poor. His mother's relatives were well-established burghers or leaders of certain political entities in Germany, and so they weren't wealthy. They weren't part of the upper class, but they certainly weren't peasants either. His father was a miner with a sideline in canny business ventures, who succeeded through sheer hard work and in building up a sizable fortune and becoming on first-name terms with local aristocracy. His father had been a miner, was called a miner, but in fact made his own way in the mining industry as a smelter, and a master smelter. And that is that he had a franchise. He was a franchisee of copper companies that required a lot of investment of his own money in the business, and the business did well. So he did well. It was a family with some means. Martin was born and died in Eisleben, as we'll see, ironically, but his childhood was spent in the smaller mining town of Mansfield, where Hans and Marguerite shortly moved after Martin's birth. Until the age of 14, he attended the Latin school in Mansfield, where he was drilled in grammar and taught the principles of logic and rhetoric, pretty much the preliminary type of study for anyone that was going to enter into university and do the university study according to the quadrivium, which we have heard about in a previous lecture. About 1497, together with a friend, Hans Reinke, he was sent to the large city of Magdeburg, and the residence of the archbishop were in all likelihood he enrolled in the Catholic school there. The school at Magdeburg was part of a monastery, which fell under the jurisdiction of a group called the Brethren of the Common Life, an order known for its piety. And this was the group that was of which Thomas à Kempis was a part. And you heard about Thomas à Kempis he will hear about Thomas à Kempis in another lecture. In his famous work, The Imitation of Christ, which still is profitable reading today. After 1 year at Magdeburg, he was sent to Eisenach, where he would pursue his studies and live with relatives that Hans and Marguerite had there. For a talented student, the next step was then the university, and in 1501, Luther chose to go to Erfurt. Luther was to live in Erfurt for the next 10 of the next 11 years, 4 at the university, 6 at the monastery. Like all beginning students, he matriculated into the Faculty of Arts, Liberal Arts, where he passed the baccalaureate exam in 1502. So he was a very bright student. He did well and advanced quickly. Preparing to become a master took a little longer and required the intense study of Aristotle, which Luther came later to vilify, the study of philosophy and Aristotelian notions like the scholastics, like we saw with Thomas Aquinas. Early in 1505, he finished the second in a class of 17 and received the symbols of a university teacher, a biretta and ring, which entitled him to give lectures and hold disputations. Luther's spiritual state is of interest even at this early point. Luther had always been sensitive in matters of his spiritual state before God, and perhaps this was fostered a little more by the time that he had spent in that monastery at Magdeburg with the Brethren of the Common Life. Throughout his life, Luther suffered from attacks of depression, during which he was tormented by doubts of his own salvation, which we're going to find out were greatly modified by what's called his tower experience, but that's coming up. We won't get ahead of ourselves here. In July of 1505, Luther had a life-changing experience. He was on his way home from his studies, back from a visit with his parents, back to his studies, and he was caught in a terrific thunderstorm. And if you've ever been outside when the lightning was flashing and you didn't have any shelter and the storm was bad, you could see how that would be a fearful experience, especially for somebody as sensitive about his spiritual condition as Luther was. Well, during this time, he cried out to Saint Anne, and Saint Anne is the purported the mother of Mary, but she is also the patron saint of miners. Of course, he came from a family of miners. And here's the account. Walking back to university after a visit to his parents, now 21-year-old Martin was suddenly caught in a July storm. A lightning bolt hit so close that it knocked him to the ground. Without the chance to make a final confession to a priest, without last rites, the prospect of what waited for him after death was too terrible to consider. As he hit the ground and the air was forced out of him, an involuntary vow came with it. Saint Anne, help me, and I shall become a monk. It was an involuntary sort of rash vow, but it was still a vow. And it was as if a bolt from heaven had forced him to become a monk, which is what he did. His father had wanted him to study law and was bitterly disappointed when Martin decided to become a monk. And I'm sure his father heard all about this thunderstorm and the vow to St. Anne, but still, it really didn't mollify him very much. Within 2 weeks, he had arranged his affairs, chose a monastery. He chose the stricter Augustinians, I suppose because he thought that would be better for his spiritual state. When news of this reached his father Hans, he was enraged. His son was supposed to have graduated from the university in order to support his parents in their old age. So you can see that Hans had some plans for Luther, but not just for Luther, but for himself and Marguerite as well. Despite this, Luther persevered, seeing his pilgrimage to the monastery as a divine constraint from God. He joined the very strict Augustinian monastery, as I said, and thus his obsession for righteousness began through monkery, as he called it. During the period 1507 to 1512, Luther experienced intense spiritual struggles as he sought to work out his own salvation by careful observance of the monastic rule, constant confession, self-mortification. Initially, Luther viewed God as a wrathful judge who expected sinners to earn their own righteousness. In later years, he reflected back on his life as a monk, and here is what he wrote. This is Luther. I myself was a monk for 20 years. I tortured myself with praying, fasting, keeping vigils, and freezing. The cold alone was enough to kill me, and I inflicted upon myself such pain as I would never afflict again, even if I could. In fact, Luther had carried out his duties with such rigor, these ascetic self-denying practices, so much that he explained, if any monk ever got to heaven by monkery, I think that's a word he made up, monkery, then I should have made it. All my monastery companions who knew me can testify to that. And he concludes by reminiscing, if it had lasted much longer, I would have killed myself with vigils, praying, reading, and other such labors. But still, there was no resolution to his spiritual crises. While he was at the monastery, his spiritual sensitivity took the form of a horrible realization that a just God would undoubtedly punish him horribly for the wretched life that he was leading. He was leading the life of a monk, pretty much an austere monk at, as he said, the highest devotion to monkery, but he still saw himself as wretched. He became obsessed with Romans 1:17, where Paul speaks of the righteousness of God. Luther learned from his scholastic studies, the medieval scholastics we talked about, that this was an active righteousness, an avenging justice, which would punish sins. And, of course, he did not find that idea very comforting. Here's Luther's words again. I, blameless monk that I was, felt that before God I was a sinner with an incredibly guilty conscience. I could not be sure that God was satisfied by what I did to appease him. I did not love him. No, I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners. In my silence, I did not say anything blasphemous, but still I complained, and I became angry with God. In the years 1510 to 1511, he took a trip to Rome. Now remember, this would have been, he would have walked all the way from Germany to Rome and then back when it was over. He did so as a representative of the German Augustinian monastery. So this was really a great privilege that was bestowed upon him by the higher authorities in the Augustinian monasteries. On his visit to Rome, however, Luther was troubled by the extravagance and corruption of the Pope and the clergy. And if you remember, this is sort of the same thing we saw with Pelagius when he went to Rome many centuries before, saw the same thing. It seems that even though Rome was the location of St. Peter's Cathedral, the heart of the Roman Catholic Church, the residence of the Pope, there was still a lot of corruption among the priests and among those that were part of the Pope's household, so to speak. While in Rome, he was shocked by the worldliness of the clergy and disillusioned by their religious indifference. In fact, one story he tells is that there were priests who would take money to say Mass for wealthy people for one reason or another, but they would take so many they would have to rush through it and just rush through the words and rush through the process without really stopping to think about what was being done. I want you to notice on this particular slide this staircase called the Scala Sacra. This staircase in Rome is supposedly a staircase that was outside of Pontius Pilate's residence in Jerusalem, but was somehow miraculously transported to Rome. And the tradition was that you can see, if you can see in that picture, small individuals there. They would basically crawl up those steps on their knees, praying set prayers as they went. And supposedly on that trip, you would gain a lot of merit that might either help you or someone else shorten their time in purgatory. At one point during his visit to Rome, this is what I'm talking about, Luther decided to ascend the steps of the Santa Scala. These steps were believed to be the very steps of Pontius Pilate's palace that had been moved from Jerusalem to Rome, as I just said. Tradition held that these were the steps that Christ had climbed. So, scaling these steps on one's knees, hands and knees, was considered a meritorious work capable of releasing deceased ones from purgatory. So Luther did it. Luther fell on his knees, began his ascent, went up a new step, paused and prayed the Lord's Prayer at every one. However, when he finally arrived at the top of the stairs, he experienced a sense of doubt about the value of the actions that he had just undertaken. And he began to question the teachings of the church. At the top of the stairs, Luther pondered, who knows whether this is really true? Upon his return to the monastery, in order to divert him from his obsessive concern for his sins and his lack of righteousness, in part due to his above-average intellect, he was assigned to pursue academic studies. While in the monastery, Luther began a serious study of theology at Erfurt. In 1508, he was sent to Wittenberg for a period of time to lecture on moral philosophy of the newly founded University of Wittenberg. Little did he know he was going to spend the rest of his life there, but he went back to Erfurt in 1509, where he continued his studies and continued to deliver lectures in theology. His teachers at Erfurt adhered to the nominalist theology of William of Ockham, and we heard about him in a previous lecture, and his disciple Gabriel Biel, which disparaged the role of reason in arriving at theological truth and emphasized their dependence upon Scripture. Unlike Aquinas, Ockhamist theologians emphasized that faith and doctrine depended more on revelation in Scripture than on reason and natural theology. So you can see here, this course of study is going to have a pretty strong effect upon his theology as a reformer that's coming up. In 1511, he was assigned to the Augustinian house in Wittenberg again, where he lived for the rest of his life, as I said. He was installed as professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg, the only regularly paid position he ever held. So he only ever held one job that got paid, and that was as the university professor, and he held that for many years. He finished his studies, obtained a doctorate degree in 1512, and became a biblical studies professor, again there in Wittenberg. As a publicly sworn doctor of theology, Luther argued that he was obligated to teach what he found in the Bible, even when that was critical of church teaching and practice. For his first course, Luther chose the biblical book that was heard and sung every day in the monastery and that he already knew almost by heart, that is, the Psalter, the book of Psalms. Since, however, he was treating the Psalms verse by verse, as his medieval predecessors had done, he didn't finish that course of study until 1515. Next, he devoted 1 year each to the 3 New Testament epistles, Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. Those courses ended in 1518, the first full year of the indulgence controversy that we'll be looking at coming up. So you can see that he spent a lot of time studying the Bible. So that was what his particular university education taught him to do. His medieval university education taught him to study Scripture. Just trust Scripture, not reason, not philosophy, just Scripture. That's what he did. And then when he got to be a professor, that's what he taught. He taught Bible, he taught the Psalms, and he taught these other books. And at the same time, he was engaged in theological discussions and various debates. Well, we're going to stop, as I said. This will be the first video of this set of PowerPoints, and we will come back, and this is where we'll begin in the next video with the second part of Luther and the beginning of the Reformation.